So good evening, everyone. I'll give him a second to affect the microphone volume adjustment. It's nice to see some of you again, and also to get to meet many of you for the first time. And I'm very honored that you actually invited me to speak to you about this particular topic, which is something which may seem a bit archaic for you, but for me it has deep roots, and I'll try to explain why. It may seem a little strange for a physician to be talking about nuclear weapons or saving the planet, but it's essential now for us to look at this from a different way, a different model, and that Physicians for Social Responsibility has been advocating and educating about the gravest threats to human health and survival for 50 years now. And it's our 50th anniversary year, and we started in 1962 with the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine about the medical consequences of nuclear weapons. Now, things have changed, and yet we still have nuclear weapons. I don't know if you are as frustrated as I with the current level of discourse in this country about the rancor and the hostility about discussing important topics, and just the gridlock in being able to solve any of the important problems that we have to face, on this planet. And so, for me, coming up with a way to reframe this topic 50 years later that will actually make a difference is the challenge. And I'm going to present to you tonight good news and bad news, not in that order. More bad news about the danger that we face, but also some good news about what it tells us about how we can solve the problem. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about nuclear famine and nuclear weapons in general, their threat to our planet. I think probably many people have heard of nuclear winter back from the 1980s, when Carl Sagan and many of the scientists were talking about just what would happen to our climate if there was a nuclear war. And many people poo-pooed that argument and said, oh, it's not true, it wouldn't happen. Current information, and what I'm going to present to you today, not only confirms those initial hypotheses, but shows just how much more dangerous these weapons really are. And I think now we're more sensitized to what climate really means for society, because we're seeing the effects of climate change and just how devastating even small perturbations in climate can be for us. Now, when I start, I usually begin with the quote from Albert Einstein: "With the splitting of the atom, everything changed save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." So in the last 50, 60 years, we've been drifting on many different fronts. But many people don't recognize that nuclear weapons are still a fundamental problem. So when I ask this to audiences, like, oh, how many nuclear weapons do you think are still around? They think after all of the peace with Russia and so on that we've gotten rid of nuclear weapons, and I hear a couple thousand nuclear weapons. No, there's 20,000 or more nuclear weapons that still exist on this planet. And so something hasn't changed. Our way of thinking has not changed. We've allowed these weapons to remain. We have allowed ourselves to be put in this danger. Now, tonight, what I'm going to talk about is some new information that actually was added to some atmospheric data that was originally done in 2007 by Toon and Robach, was to the effects of even a small exchange of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan. And then what was added most recently last year was the notion of what this would mean for production of food on the planet, and what that would mean to the people who might starve, and therefore the title nuclear famine. So the simulation, or the scenario that was used for this, was a relatively believable one in which India and Pakistan went to war, and they've gone to war 3 times since independence, so this is not an unusual occurrence for them, but they actually used their nuclear weapons. Now, we're in the simulation, we're assuming about 50 nuclear weapons, each about the size of Hiroshima, on each side of the conflict. And this is quite reasonable. They have at least that much, if not some of maybe twice as many of those weapons in their armaments. And therefore, if they did go to war, that's a reasonable expectation. Not only would these weapons, as we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just devastate cities and kill upwards of 20 million people instantaneously on both sides of the conflict, but the amount of radioactive material that would be spewed out would contaminate the entire region where we know billions of people actually live. And the part that we're going to focus on tonight is the global climate disruption that would occur by this material that was lofted up into the stratosphere. So what happens with nuclear weapons is they produce extremely, extremely hot explosions that when detonated over cities consume all of the flammable materials, the petrol, the wood, the paper, anything that would burn, and they produce these massive firestorms. And this produces high amounts of soot. As a matter of fact, this scenario imagines 5 million tons of soot and dust that would be lofted up into the upper atmosphere. And this would spread out over the planet, absorbing the sunlight and essentially blocking the heat from reaching the planet. Now, this would lead to a large and very rapid drop in temperature on the planet, similar to what was discussed with the nuclear winter scenario of about 1¼ degrees centigrade. Now, what does 1¼ degrees centigrade mean? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's a lot of temperature drop. But if we compare what has happened over the last several hundred years, what we see is that the entire global warming activity has been somewhat on the orders of 0.7 degrees centigrade. And if you look at the red line on the graph, what you see is that in the very short period of time after an exchange of these nuclear weapons and the soot being lofted up into the stratosphere, you would see a marked drop in temperatures of 1.25 degrees, something that is basically unprecedented in duration and in amount in recorded history. Now, many people look at this and I hear these comments like, oh, this is the solution to global warming. All we have to do is, blow up India and Pakistan. Now, I mean, joking aside, I mean, this is, even if we imagine that there was a way to loft this much soot up into the atmosphere, the thing to remember is that this is a 10-year or a decade-long occurrence. When that soot comes back down eventually, we are exactly in the position that we were in before. As a matter of fact, there'd be even more CO2 production from all the fires, and therefore this is not a solution. And so we cannot allow not only these weapons to be used for humanitarian reasons, but it's not a solution to global warming. So in addition to the temperatures that would be dropping across the planet, what you see from the simulations and the computer scenarios, which are highly sophisticated now, they're even much more sophisticated than they were in the 80s. What you find is that the temperatures drop and the amount of time that crops are available to grow, the growing season, is shortened. Now, many crops that we depend on only ripen in the last few days of their growing season before they are harvested. So what you see from these charts is that the actual amount of shortening of the season is anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks of growing time, many of which would eliminate the crop that was being grown at that time. So change in growing season means that frost would occur, that there would be likely destruction of the plants early, they wouldn't have a chance to mature. Now, in addition to actually blocking out the sunlight, this also affects the amount of rainfall. Now, we just went through a drastic drought here in the Midwest in just 1 year, which had a significant impact on our corn crops. What we see from these simulations is that in this environment where we've had this nuclear war all the way over in India and Pakistan, that we would have an overall 10% reduction in rainfall, but that would actually be concentrated in many areas. And if you look at the key areas of our growing areas, both in Central Asia, Europe, and North America, that you could have upwards of 40% reduction in rain. And this is not just for year one, but for a decade. So you can imagine what it would be like to have year after year of droughts like what we had just this year. Now, people say, do we have any reason to believe that this would actually happen? Well, the answer actually is yes, because we've had a bit of an example. And that was back in 1815, the Tambora volcano erupted. And it produced a lot of soot. Not nearly as much as what we're talking about in this case, but it dropped the temperature about half of what we would anticipate, 0.7 degrees. And this led to the year without a summer in 1816. So it dramatically reduced the growing season. There were killing frosts across the United States in June and July, and twice in August. So if you were expecting your crops to grow during that time, a frost comes in, it destroys the crop. And there were widespread famine reported in Ireland, France, Switzerland, the German states, and in India. So this was even a long time ago. It produced a short-term drop, but it shows us the kind of effect that we would anticipate if nuclear weapons were used between India and Pakistan, leading to this scenario. So if we look at the impact on agriculture, which is the additional studies that were done this time, you have this sudden cooling, the decreased sunlight, less rainfall. This shortens the growing season. This reduces crop yields. It leads to less food being available. In addition, the stratospheric ozone is depleted by the damage from these materials that are lofted into the stratosphere, which means that other crops that are more sensitive to UV radiation are likely to be affected. We know that in addition to the shortening of the seasons and the rainfall and the ozone, there's also going to be the disruption in petroleum supplies, which are necessary for farm machinery, for fertilizer. And so that's going to make a distribution and the fertilization of the crops and the pesticides less available. And then you're going to have this whole area that's radioactively contaminated, just like as we've seen in Fukushima, that there's going to be parts of the landmass in very key areas of South Asia that won't even be available to produce crops. And this will lead to an overall collapse in the distribution system. Now, the part that was added most recently by Dr. Helfand and the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, who I neglected to mention at the very beginning, who were the sponsors of this report, looked at 3 major crops, 2 in the United States and 1 in Asia. And these were corn and soybeans in the United States. And what they did was they actually said, okay, given this impact that we were going to imagine on the climate, what would actually happen to food production here in the United States? And they picked 4 different states. And what you see is that the vast majority, if you look at the sort of the orange and darker yellow bars here, when they run these simulations over and over again, most of them showed, or the majority of them showed, a decrease in production on the order of 10, 15, 20% over a decade. And when we did the same analysis using soybeans, what we saw is a similar effect across the soybean production. Now, this was our initial studies that were done and showed what we anticipated would be the sort of best case scenario if this should happen. And more recent analyses are even showing even worse effects on crops, but we aren't yet able to release that information. And what we find, though, is it's not just a matter of reducing crops in the short term, but that what you see is over the entire decade that the amount of crop production is variable, and in this case actually is maximized at about 25% in the 5th year. So what we're talking about is shortage on top of shortage on top of shortage. Now, we also looked at Jia and others looked at the Chinese rice production, because much of the world does not depend on corn or soybeans, but rice. And what they found was even a larger decline, around 15% in Chinese rice production. And for them, again, it was extended over the entire decade. And it wasn't evenly distributed. Whereas some parts of the Chinese mainland was actually maybe had slightly increased crop production, the ones very low toward the bottom near Hong Kong, the vast majority of the country actually was going to suffer significant losses. And if you look along the northern border, in that province, what you see is almost a complete loss of crop. So in this province of 36 million people, for the almost entire time, there is a significant reduction in crops, and at the beginning, a complete loss of the rice crop. This means that the people who are dependent upon rice are not going to have it. And the world has become more and more efficient. We've wrung out any of the reserved in an attempt to try to to lower the cost of food production. We've removed a lot of that stored food that was available on the planet, from 100 to 120 days down to only 70 or 80 days, which in other words, if there was no more food, we'd only have about 2 to 3 months worth of food left on the planet to feed the people here. So any significant reduction in production is going to have an impact on that food that's available for people. Now, what does this really mean? Much of the work that I do is in Africa right now. I work with the Earth Institute and the Millennium Villages Project. And so I see chronic malnutrition firsthand across many of the countries that I work on. Here in the United States, malnutrition is a significant problem. We know that it takes somewhere on the order of 1,800 to 2,000, 2,200 calories just to meet the minimum requirements for a human. And that there are almost 925 million people who are already below that level and unable to meet their caloric intake. Now, what you can imagine is that these 925 million, when we add on top of that a reduction of 10 to 15, 20% over a decade, this is going to put that entire group at risk. And if you imagine what would happen in the case of a world where the food supply was suddenly shortened, just like, I don't know if you remember when we diverted some of the corn from our corn production into ethanol, that it actually caused a spike in food production because we had diverted even a small amount of the corn of our crop to energy instead of food. So we know that this will happen, that there will be an increased price in food, and that will make it even harder for these people to obtain the food that they need. There's been an example of this where there was a famine in 1943. It was the Great Bengal Famine, where food production in Bengal only declined by 5%, but it was actually 13%, the amount of the famine was actually 13% higher than in 1941 when there was no famine, and 3 million people died. So the amount of panic and the restriction on the food supply by hoard buying, increased pricing of the food actually produces distribution problems and people starve. And what does this mean? It means up to 1 billion people will be dead from starvation alone in this scenario. So not only would there be the 900 million people who were already malnourished, but the hundreds of millions of people who would become malnourished because of their inability to get food in the post-war decade. Now, this is bad enough, but we can't anticipate more problems. Because we know that in the case of this type of exchange, the mass devastation in societies, the mass migration of people, the effects on starvation and their ability to feed and clothe themselves, that there's going to be epidemic diseases like plague and cholera, malaria and typhus, that this is going to have major impacts on the people that are both in refugee camps as well as those that choose to stay at home. And what about the further use of nuclear weapons? Because once that bar has been crossed, once there has been actual use of nuclear weapons, what's to stop them to be used again? And when you imagine this world in which we live, pressured by famine, pressured by loss of resources, broken down distribution systems, lack of petrol and fossil fuels, there's going to be a tremendous pressure to go out and get those resources, and countries are going to want, through force, to take them. And this means that there's a possibility of further use of nuclear weapons. So, what does this tell us? Well, these findings remind us that we need a fundamental change in the way we think about nuclear weapons. First, we have to understand now that it's no longer just the United States and Russia that pose a global threat. We've always talked about US and Russia going to war, and that would be the end of humanity. Now, we have something else to worry about. That smaller powers, like India and Pakistan, threaten not only each other, but all of humanity. Because if they should go to war, their global consequences and climate disruption would affect everyone. And this means we have to look at our much larger arsenals. We talked about the 10,000 nuclear weapons that the US and Russia each have, but particularly the US and Russia in a totally different way. So how many people are familiar with the Trident submarine? Incredibly powerful part of the US arsenal. So the Trident submarine has 24 missiles. Each one of those contains 4 warheads, which means a total of 96 warheads. Each one of those warheads is 20 to 30 times more powerful than the Hiroshima-sized weapons that I was just talking about that would be used by India and Pakistan. So what does that mean? That means that one Trident submarine could actually bring about this global famine scenario that I just talked about. And we have 14 Trident submarines. Now, when you think about now, and all this talk you're hearing about where we're spending our money and the budget of the United States and how we have to cut Medicare and Medicaid, think about how much money we spend on nuclear weapons. And what does it really mean? What does deterrence mean in this kind of situation when 5% of our weapons can kill 1 billion people? Do we need 10,000? Do we need 14 Trident submarines? Now, many people were very heartened by the New START agreement, which, despite a great deal of resistance, was ratified in the US Senate. And that lowered each of our arsenals between the US and Russia to 1,550 weapons and delivery systems each. Now, you think, okay, we can relax. There's only 1,500 weapons. What would happen if we actually did go to war? Whether it was due to India and Pakistan, or whether we misjudged something with China, or this recent increased tensions over with Russia and about the ballistic missile defense has actually led to an exchange between the United States and Russia. Whereas we were talking about 5 million tons of soot, that exchange would produce 150 million tons. And that wouldn't just drop the temperatures 1.25 degrees centigrade, but up to 8 degrees. And it's, as you can see from the picture, the area in which most of us live is 15 degrees centigrade drop in temperature. This means that there would not be a single day for a decade in the northern hemisphere where there would not be snow and frost on the ground. It would be like a new ice age. And that would basically eliminate all agricultural production, eliminating human life on this planet. So the data that was done for nuclear winter in the past with much larger numbers has here been reconfirmed with much more sophisticated numbers. And even with the numbers that we're sitting at right now, we could actually extinguish life on this planet. So this is a real problem. And it forces us into a decision. And this is where I think, perhaps, there is a silver lining. Because it tells us something about who we are, about our planet, and about what we can do to improve our chances of survival and guarantee our chances for survival. Because we know that if we do nothing, if we do not change the way we think, as Einstein said, if we stay on the same path that we are on, we are inevitably going to get to the destination in which we are headed, which is disaster. We must make a change. We have to consciously make a change. Every one of you and I need to commit to something new. If we are going to change the path, we cannot hope to stay on the same road and get to a different destination. Now, I just became a new father, and my son had his first birthday last week. And it certainly changed my perspective on the world. And I was thinking about the joy in this child for having the first balloons. He'd never seen, balloons before. And what kind of life is he going to have? I was trying to imagine, 50 years from now, when he is my age and trying to figure out where he's going to live. Is he going to have to buy a house that's far enough away from the ocean that the rising oceans aren't going to destroy his property? Is there going to be enough food production? Will we even be here? And so, for me, this is the motivation. Even if I've been working in this work since 1982, it has a real meaning for me now. And it has shown me that there is also hope. Because it is possible to live safely and sustainably on this planet. We can eliminate nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, that's probably the easy part. The critical issues of nuclear weapons, climate change, poverty, toxic degradation of the environment are not going to be dealt with easily. Nuclear weapons is something we could legislate them out. These other things are going to require even more work. But what can we learn about eliminating nuclear weapons that will help us save the planet? The first is that all of us must play our part. This is not about the 1% or the 99%. This is about the 100%. Everybody has a role to play. We cannot leave anyone out. As a matter of fact, it's probably about the 150% because there are generations and generations of people who are coming after us who depend upon the decisions that we make right now. It's no longer sufficient for us to make decisions based on expediency or short-term benefit. We have to start thinking about the future. And so I'm going to make a proposal to you, something that I've thought about and has come from other domains, but I'm going to propose that there are three fundamental universal principles that underlie all of our society, that if we made available and transparent to ourselves, and that the practice of those principles were put into place, that we have a real chance of turning this around. And there are three areas that I think we act, and that's why there are three principles. There's our personal domain in which we live, ourselves, our family, our close members of our community. There's the community at large domain in which we act, our schools, our society. And then there's really the global domain of the entire planet. And each one of those has a general principle, and there are probably more than one, but I'm going to talk about three. So on a personal level, I think the fundamental principle that we have learned is about respect. And that is that if we look at the equality of all human beings on this planet, what we find is that we are all miracles. We are all success stories. We are the product of 13.5 billion years of evolution. Each one of us, all of our ancestors, must have survived for us to be here. So in a way, we're all miracles and we're all survivors. We can continue to survive. But we have to treat each other differently. And so the practice at this level is one of tolerance. We can no longer have the kind of discourse that we've had in this society. We have to recognize that everyone has something important to say, and that we have to resolve our conflicts without violence. Now this starts by learning first to respect and love ourselves, and then be able to expand that to others in our community. And I know here in the Unitarian Church that this is not an unusual idea. On a community level, I think that the principle is one of interdependence. Now, physicians are both scientists and humanists. We know that science has taught us just how incredibly small this planet is, how interdependent all of us are. It's not just our food supply. It's our economies. It's even the air we breathe. We know now that if the dust that blows off the Sahara Desert actually increases asthma rates in the United States. We know that diseases like SARS and bird flu don't listen to national boundaries. We know how intensely connected our climate actually is. And what this means is that our practice must be one of altruism or generosity. Because it's no longer just about survival ourselves, it's survival of all of us. We can no longer be happy or imagine that we can survive without others surviving as well. On a global level, I think that the issue is universal responsibility. This is the fundamental principle. We live on one very small planet. And I remember when I talk about universal responsibility in a small planet, I remember the words of Rusty Schweickart, who was the Apollo 9 astronaut, who was up in his capsule and he was looking through the window of his capsule down on the planet. And he saw just one planet. There were no national boundaries. He saw that everything that he cared about, all the art and music, all the people that he loved or anyone he would ever love was on that planet that was down out there through his window that he could cover with his own thumb. There is no other place where we can go. This is it. And so we have to think about restraint. We can no longer consume and consume with no thought about the future. It's sort of like the Native American proverb that says, we do not inherit this planet from our grandparents, we're borrowing it from our grandchildren. Alon, my child, and all of the grandchildren that will come after him depend upon what we are doing now. We cannot consume, we cannot poison the environment. We cannot, leave the degradation of Fukushima or Chernobyl that will last decades and centuries and poison our planet. We must come up with different solutions. Now, I believe that it's possible if we are able to bring these principles into our lives, if we start thinking about how to make these material changes, that we can change the direction that we are in. What else can you do besides that? What are the tangible topics that you can do? Well, first, just like you're here tonight, you can become informed. And it's important not just to become informed about the problems. This is what we learned from the 1980s when we talked about nuclear freeze and the nuclear weapons at that time. We can scare the bejesus out of people. And they get all up in arms for a little while. And then they get numb. And they go back to sleep because it's just too terrible to think about. What I told you today is really terrible. But it's not enough to think about just the terrible parts. We have to think about the solutions because there are solutions that we can deal with. There are ways to produce energy in a way that doesn't poison the environment. There are ways to get rid of nuclear weapons. There are ways for us to resolve conflict without violence. Now, on January 26th, PSR is going to be actually leading a speakers training program about nuclear famine. There's a sign-up sheet in the back of the room. I encourage you that if you would like to learn more and be able to actually talk about nuclear famine and about the solutions that you may be able to discuss with your community, I welcome your participation on the 26th. You can advocate for a nuclear weapons convention. You know, there's a biological weapons convention, there's a chemical weapons convention. It's illegal to store or use those weapons. Why are the most destructive that threaten our actual existence on this planet not illegal? They're already ruled immoral by the World Court. So we can, and there is a modified or a version of the Nuclear Weapons Convention that's actually being circulated right now. So I encourage you to become involved. There's a petition also in the back of the room for nuclear abolition and nuclear disarmament. Make your voices heard. Join with the 100% who demand survival on this planet. You can think beyond nuclear weapons. You can reduce your carbon footprint. You can switch to sustainable and renewable sources of energy. You can do this in your home by choosing a source of energy different from the Public Utilities Commissions, or you can work within your communities to spread the word, to shift the emphasis from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I don't know how many people have heard of the Do the Math tour. How many people have heard of that tour that Bill McKibben has been doing from the 350.org? That's a remarkable project that's going around the country right now to raise awareness about how we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels the way we are currently planning to do, or it will eliminate our life on this planet. So we can make those changes and eliminate the pressure on societies that would lead to violence and the use of nuclear weapons. And as physicians, one of the main things we want to talk about are a prescription for survival, which involves living healthy and sustainably, not just for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren. And that those choices can be made by each one of us. We can make a decision as to whether we're going to take the bus or the subway or drive the car. We can make a decision as to whether we're going to buy that thing that we think we need or not, whether we're going to reuse or recycle. There are many things that we do on a daily basis. And what I think we have learned is that we have reached a place on this planet where each one of our actions can lead to the destruction of the planet. We add up to such a remarkable negative impact on this planet. We are talking now, again, about not having a future. In the same way that all these bad things add up, the good things also add up. So I would just remind you that every small thing that you do, every day that you get up and do, will add up and will make a difference. And finally, you can become a member of PSR. You can join with us to help get the word out and to be seen as working together with our colleagues in different other organizations to build a world that's safe from nuclear weapons and from these other severe issues that I've talked about. And you don't have to be a physician. I like to say that anyone who cares about the health of the planet and the future of the planet is a physician for social responsibility. So we are the largest physician-led organization working on these issues, but you know, many of our members are not physicians or healthcare providers at all. So we can work together. I believe that together, if we are able to bring about that new way of thinking, if we try to take those principles of respect and tolerance, of interdependence and altruism and generosity, and finally universal responsibility and restraint, and put them into our lives, we can make a difference. Now there's one other significant quote that Albert Einstein talked about. When he mentioned that there was a change in the way we had to think, many people just sort of said, well, what does that really mean? He said that a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts, and our feelings as something separate from the rest. It's kind of an optical delusion of our consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us. It restricts us to our personal desires and to affection for a few people nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. What we've seen again and again as science, as humans, that this planet is interdependent, that small changes have big effects both for positive or for negative. Our choice, our challenge, must be to choose the positive. And so I ask all of you to join us to make that positive change in your own lives and to help spread the word to others so that circle of compassion really can include all of us. And there can be a future, not just for me and for my family and my children, but for you, your children, your grandchildren, and their grandchildren. So thank you very much.